Some things don't get lost by accident. They arrive exactly where they're meant to be. The wind came hard across the plains that night, carrying dust and the faint scent of rain that never quite reached the ground. And Ethan Cole stood in the doorway of his weathered ranch house, one hand resting against the splintered frame, listening to the low hum of an engine fading somewhere beyond the dark stretch of dirt road. He hadn't been expecting anyone, not this late, not anymore. And yet there it was, the sound of tires crunching gravel, stopping just long enough to leave something behind before disappearing into the night like it had never been there at all. He waited, still as the fence posts lining his land, until the silence settled again, thick and uneasy, then stepped forward, boots pressing into the dry earth as the porch light flickered weakly above him, casting long shadows that stretched toward the gate. And that's when he saw it, a shape standing just beyond the reach of the light, motionless, watching, the outline of a horse, thin, too thin, its ribs faintly visible even in the dim glow, its coat a pale gray that seemed to catch what little light there was and hold on to it like something fragile. Ethan frowned, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold as he moved closer, the gravel crunching beneath his boots the only sound between them. The horse didn't move, didn't shy away. It just stood there, head slightly lowered, breath slow and shallow, as if it had already traveled farther than it should have. A rope hung loose from its neck, frayed at the end. No tag, no clear marking, just a worn piece of leather that looked like it had been handled too many times. Ethan reached the gate and pushed it open with a creak that echoed louder than it should have. "You're a long way from where you belong," he muttered, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. The horse lifted its head just enough to meet his eyes, and something in that gaze made him pause. Not fear, not desperation. Something quieter, steadier, like it had been waiting. Not for a place, but for a person. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing back toward the empty road where the truck had vanished. Whoever dropped it off wasn't coming back. That much was clear. He stepped closer, hand hovering before finally resting against the horse's neck. The coat was cold beneath his fingers, but not lifeless. The animal shifted slightly, leaning into the touch just enough to feel it, then stilled again. "Wrong ranch," Ethan said under his breath, shaking his head, already thinking about who he'd have to call in the morning, how he'd explain this, how he'd get it off his land before it became his problem. But even as he reached for the rope, the horse didn't pull away, didn't resist. It simply stood there, breathing slow, eyes fixed on him with a quiet intensity that made the night feel heavier, as if something unseen had settled between them, something that didn't belong to chance or mistake. And for a brief moment, Ethan felt it, the faint, unsettling sense that whatever had been dropped at his gate wasn't lost at all, just early. The barn had not held a horse in over 3 years, and it seemed to remember that fact as Ethan led the gray Mustang through the half-broken gate, the hinges groaning in protest like something long forgotten being asked to wake again. The smell of dry hay and old wood drifted out to meet them, thick with dust and memory. And for a moment he hesitated, his hand tightening slightly around the rope as the horse paused beside him, its ears flicking once toward the dark interior, then back toward the open land behind them as if measuring the distance between staying and leaving. "It is just for the night," Ethan said quietly, though the words sounded more like a promise to himself than to the animal. He stepped inside first, boots stirring up a thin cloud of dust that caught the lantern light in slow, drifting particles. The stall at the far end still stood, crooked but usable, its wooden rails worn smooth by years that no longer mattered. He tied the rope loosely, careful not to pull, and the horse followed without resistance, stepping into the stall with a strange kind of calm, as if it had already accepted the place before seeing it. Ethan moved slowly, setting down an old bucket, filling it halfway from the hand pump outside. The water ran thin and uneven, but it was enough. He carried it back, the metal handle creaking softly, and set it near the horse. Waiting, watching, the animal lowered its head, not with urgency, but with quiet intention, taking a few careful sips before lifting its gaze again, not at the water, but at him, steady, unblinking, the kind of look that made silence feel heavier than words. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck as he stepped away, giving it space. He found an old blanket folded in the corner, stiff with age, and draped it gently across the horse's back. The fabric settled unevenly over its thin frame. But the animal did not flinch, did not step away. It only shifted its weight slightly, as if acknowledging the gesture without needing to understand it. Outside, the wind brushed against the barn walls, low and constant, carrying with it the distant sound of something loose tapping against metal. A hollow rhythm that echoed faintly through the structure. The horse's ears twitched sharply at the sound, its head lifting, muscles tensing just enough to notice. Ethan followed its gaze toward the far wall where an old chain hung from a nail, swaying lightly in the draft, tapping against a rusted hook with each movement. He frowned, stepping over to still it with one hand. The metal fell silent instantly, and the change was immediate. The horse's body eased, the tension fading like a held breath finally released. Ethan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his hand still resting on the chain, eyes narrowing slightly as a thought flickered and passed too quickly to catch. He turned back toward the stall, studying the animal again. The way it stood, not restless, not afraid, but alert in a way that felt deliberate, as if it was listening for something beyond the walls of the barn, something only it could hear. "You are not just sick," he muttered under his breath, though he could not have said why. The horse shifted again, one hoof pressing lightly into the dirt floor, then again in the same spot, a soft, repetitive motion that barely made a sound. Ethan noticed it, the small details standing out against the quiet. He stepped closer, crouching just outside the stall, watching as the hoof pressed down once more, then stilled. The ground beneath it looked no different than the rest, dry, compact, ordinary, but the horse did not move away. It kept its weight there, as if marking something unseen. Ethan felt a faint unease settle in his chest, not fear, but something quieter, something that did not yet have a name. He straightened slowly, glancing once toward the closed barn doors, then back to the horse, and for the first time since it had arrived, the thought crossed his mind, clear and unwelcome, that maybe whatever had been left at his gate was not waiting to be sent back at all, but waiting for him to notice something he had not yet begun to understand. Morning came slow across the ranch, not with color, but with a pale gray light that stretched thin over the land like something unsure of staying. And Ethan was already awake before it reached the windows, sitting at the edge of his bed with his boots half-laced, listening. The silence inside the house felt different, not empty the way it had been for years, but waiting. He finished tying his laces and stepped outside. The air carried a cool edge, dry and sharp, and the barn stood where it always had, quiet against the horizon. But now it seemed to hold something inside it that did not belong to memory. He crossed the yard without rushing, each step measured, as if he did not want to disturb whatever had settled there overnight. The barn door creaked open under his hand, and the smell of dust and hay greeted him again, unchanged. But the stillness inside felt heavier, more deliberate. The horse stood in the same stall, exactly where he had left it, head lowered slightly, but its eyes were open, alert, fixed on the far end of the barn as though it had been watching something long before he arrived. "You did not sleep much, did you?" Ethan said quietly, though the words were more habit than question. He stepped closer, noticing the bucket still half full, the blanket still resting across the animal's back. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place, except the horse itself, which seemed more present now, less like something fading and more like something holding on. He reached out, resting his hand along its neck, the warmth beneath the coat stronger than it had been the night before, subtle. But there, the horse shifted slightly under his touch, then lifted its head just enough to glance at him before turning back again toward the same direction, that same invisible point beyond the barn wall. Ethan followed its gaze, eyes narrowing as he studied the weathered boards, the cracks where light slipped through in thin lines. The place looked no different than it had for years, and yet the way the horse watched it made the space feel unfamiliar, as if something had changed without leaving a mark. A faint sound broke the quiet, not loud, not sudden, just the soft press of a hoof against dirt. Ethan looked down. The horse had moved again, pressing its front hoof into the same spot as before, once, then again, slow, deliberate. The motion was not restless, not nervous. It was measured, intentional, as though it was trying to show something without knowing how. Ethan crouched, brushing his fingers lightly over the ground just beyond the stall rail. The dirt felt firm, packed from years of use. But as his hand moved across the surface, he noticed it, a slight difference in texture, not soft exactly, but uneven, as though it had been disturbed at some point and settled again. He pressed down gently, testing it. The ground gave just enough to notice, then held. He pulled his hand back, glancing up at the horse, which was now watching him instead. Its gaze steady, patient, almost expectant. Ethan stood slowly, wiping his hand against his jeans, the thought forming again, clearer this time, that whatever this was, it was not random, not a coincidence. He stepped back, looking around the barn as if seeing it for the first time. The old tools hanging along the wall, the empty stalls, the quiet corners that had held nothing for years, and yet now felt like they were waiting to be understood. "You keep looking there," he said softly, more to himself than to the animal. "Like there is something I missed." The horse did not move, did not react. It simply held his gaze, and in that stillness, Ethan felt it again, that quiet pull. Not urgency, not fear, but a slow, steady insistence that something beneath the surface of this place had not been finished, not forgotten, just waiting, and for reasons he could not explain, he found himself no longer thinking about calling anyone to take the horse away, no longer thinking about wrong deliveries or mistakes. Instead, his attention stayed fixed on the ground beneath that single hoofprint, and the unsettling realization that maybe the horse had not been brought here by accident at all, but had come because something buried beneath his own land had been waiting longer than he had. The sun climbed higher but never quite warmed the barn, its light slipping through the cracks in thin golden lines that stretched across the dirt floor and stopped just short of the place where the horse kept pressing its hoof. And Ethan stood there longer than he meant to, staring at that same patch of ground, as if it might explain itself if he gave it enough time. But the earth stayed quiet, holding whatever it held without a sound. He exhaled slowly and turned away, reaching for the old shovel leaning against the far wall, the wood handle worn smooth from hands that were not his anymore. For a moment he hesitated, fingers resting along the grain, a memory brushing past him like wine through dry grass. Something about digging, about uncovering things better left buried, but it faded before it could take shape, and he walked back to the stall, the shovel's edge pressing lightly into the dirt just outside where the hoof had marked its place. The first push was shallow, testing, the soil resisting at first before giving just enough to break apart, dry clumps shifting aside with a soft, brittle sound. The horse did not move, did not flinch at the motion, it only watched, its gaze following each movement with quiet intensity, as if this was not something new, but something expected. Ethan worked slowly, not digging deep, just clearing the surface layer inch by inch. The ground changed almost immediately, the top layer dry and pale, but beneath it darker, heavier, as though it had been turned once before and then left to settle again. He paused, leaning slightly on the shovel, eyes narrowing as the pattern became clearer. This was not natural settling, not the kind of shift that came from time alone. This had been done by hands, deliberate, careful, and then hidden again. A faint unease crept in, subtle but steady, the kind that did not rush in but built slowly, like a thought forming in the back of the mind before it was fully understood. He pushed the shovel in again, this time a little deeper, the metal edge striking something that was not stone but not soil either, a dull, hollow sound that did not belong there. Ethan froze, the echo of it lingering in the still air. The horse shifted slightly behind him, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just adjusting its weight as if acknowledging the moment. He crouched down, brushing the dirt aside with his hands now, more careful, more deliberate. The shape beneath the soil began to take form, edges too straight to be natural, a surface that caught the light differently, muted but distinct. His fingers traced along it, uncovering a corner, then another, until the outline revealed itself as something buried with purpose, not lost, not forgotten, but placed. Ethan sat back on his heels, his breath slow, controlled, though his chest felt tighter than before. The barn seemed quieter now, the outside world dimmed as if the moment had pulled everything inward. He glanced back at the horse, which stood exactly where it had been, watching him with the same steady gaze, no fear, no surprise. only a quiet certainty that made his stomach turn in a way he could not explain. "You knew," he said under his breath, though he did not expect an answer. And yet the way the horse held his gaze made the words feel less like a question and more like a realization. Ethan looked back down at the partially uncovered object, the edges clearer now, the surface worn but intact. Whatever it was, it had been waiting there a long time, longer than he had owned this land, longer than he had lived with. The silence that filled it, and for the first time since the horse arrived, the thought came fully into focus, not as a passing idea, but as something solid and undeniable, that the animal standing behind him had not been brought here by mistake, and that whatever lay buried beneath his barn was not something he had found, but something that had been brought back to him. For a long moment Ethan did not move, the dirt still clinging to his hands as he stared at the edges of what he had uncovered, the shape now clearer beneath the thin layer of soil, a flat surface with corners too clean to belong to chance. He leaned forward slowly, brushing more earth away with careful fingers, the grain sliding aside to reveal a weathered lid, metal, dulled by time, but not broken. Its surface marked with faint scratches and a thin line of rust along one edge, as though it had been sealed away from air and memory for longer than it should have been. His breath came quieter now, measured, the kind of silence that settles when something shifts from curiosity into something deeper, something that carries weight. He glanced once toward the barn doors, half expecting the outside world to press in, to interrupt, but nothing moved beyond the thin strips of light. The ranch remained still, untouched, as if this moment belonged only to him and the horse standing just behind. He reached for the shovel again, sliding it gently beneath the edge of the metal, testing the resistance. The soil gave way easier now, as though whatever held it in place had already decided to loosen its grip. With a careful lift, the lid shifted slightly, enough to let a thin line of darkness show beneath it. Ethan paused, his hand tightening along the handle, not from fear, but from the quiet realization that whatever lay inside had been waiting, not just buried, but kept. He set the shovel aside and used both hands now, fingers curling under the edge, the metal cold against his skin. He lifted slowly, the lid rising with a soft, hollow sound that echoed faintly through the barn, and then it opened. Inside, there was no shine, no sudden reveal of anything obvious, just a collection of objects resting in stillness, wrapped in cloth that had aged to a pale, brittle texture, tied with a thin cord that had once been strong but now looked ready to give at the slightest pull. Ethan stared at it, the simplicity of it almost more unsettling than anything else. No markings, no explanation, just something hidden away and left behind. He reached in carefully, lifting the bundle with both hands, the weight lighter than he expected, but not empty. The cloth shifted slightly as he set it down on the dirt beside him, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before loosening the cord. It fell away easily, the knot unraveling as though it had been waiting for this moment as well. He peeled back the cloth slowly, layer by layer, revealing what had been protected inside. First came paper, old, yellowed at the edges, folded neatly despite the years. Beneath it, something else, a small metal object, smooth, worn, its shape familiar in a way that stirred something at the back of his mind. He froze, his breath catching just enough to notice, his hand hovering above it without touching. The memory did not come all at once. It moved slowly, like something rising through deep water, a flicker of recognition that refused to fully surface. Behind him, the horse shifted its weight again, one quiet step that brought it closer to the stall rail, its presence steady, unchanging, as if this was always the place it had been leading toward. Ethan finally reached down, picking up the metal object, turning it in his hand, the surface warm now from his touch, and as the light caught it just right, the shape became undeniable, not new, not strange, but known, something that belonged to a past he had spent years trying not to revisit. His chest tightened, not sharply, but with a slow, pressing weight, the kind that comes when something long buried refuses to stay that way any longer. He lowered the object back onto the cloth, his gaze shifting to the folded paper beside it, and though he had not opened it yet, had not read a single word, he already felt it. The quiet certainty that whatever truth lay inside this box was not just hidden beneath his land, but tied to him in a way he could no longer ignore. And for the first time since the horse arrived, Ethan understood that this was no longer about a wrong delivery or a stray animal left behind in the dark. This was something older, something deliberate. And whatever it was, it had finally found its way back. The paper felt thinner than it should have, fragile beneath Ethan's fingers as he lifted it from the cloth, the edges worn soft by time. The fold lines pressed so deeply they seemed permanent, like the words inside had been waiting in silence for years too long. He turned it over once, noticing there was no name written on the outside, no marking to explain why it had been hidden, only the quiet weight of something meant to be read by the right person and no one else. He hesitated, his thumb resting along the crease, and for a brief moment he considered setting it back down, covering it again, leaving it where it had been. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, because the presence of the horse behind him made that impossible now. He could feel it without looking, that steady awareness, like a witness to something already set in motion. He unfolded the paper slowly, careful not to tear it, the dry fibers whispering softly as they opened. The ink inside had faded slightly, but not enough to hide the words. They were still clear, written in a steady hand that carried a kind of quiet certainty, the kind that does not rush or hesitate. Ethan's eyes moved across the first line, and then stopped, not because he could not read it, but because something in it struck deeper than the words themselves. He read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle. The message was not long, just a few lines, but it did not need more. It spoke plainly, directly, as though the writer had known exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. It spoke of the land, of something hidden beneath it, something that had been kept safe not for its value, but for its meaning. It spoke of a choice, of leaving it buried or bringing it back into the light. And then it said something that made Ethan's chest tighten in a way he could not ignore. It mentioned a name, not his own, but one he had not heard spoken in years, not out loud, not even in memory, without quickly pushing it aside. The sound of it now, even in silence, felt heavier than it should have, like a door opening somewhere he had kept closed. His hand trembled just slightly, enough for him to notice. He lowered the paper, staring at the words as if they might change if he looked away. But they did not. They stayed exactly as they were, quiet and certain. The horse shifted behind him again, one soft step closer, its presence now just at the edge of the stall, as if the distance between them had been closing all along. Ethan swallowed slowly, his gaze moving back to the metal object resting beside the cloth, the recognition from before returning stronger now, clearer, the shape, the weight. It was not just familiar. It belonged to something he had once known well, something tied to that same name written on the page. He reached for it again, turning it over in his hand, and this time he saw it fully, the small engraving along its side, worn but still there, a mark he had seen years ago in a place he had not allowed himself to revisit. The connection formed all at once now, no longer a flicker, but a complete and undeniable truth. This had not been buried by strangers. This had not been left by accident. It had been placed here by someone who knew this land, someone who had chosen this exact spot, and somehow, through time and distance and silence, it had found its way back to him. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to steady himself, because the weight of what he was holding was no longer just physical. It carried memory. It carried something unresolved, and when he opened them again, his gaze shifted not to the box or the paper, but to the horse, which now stood fully facing him, its eyes calm, unwavering, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. And in that quiet exchange, Ethan understood something he had not been ready to see before, that the horse had not just led him to what was buried beneath the barn. It had led him back to something he had tried to leave behind. And whatever came next would not be about uncovering the past, but facing it. The name stayed with him long after his eyes left the paper, not as a sound, but as a presence, something that settled into the space around him and refused to fade. Ethan rose slowly from the dirt floor, the folded letter still in his hand, the metal object resting heavy in his other palm. And for a moment he simply stood there, caught between what he had just uncovered and what it meant. The barn no longer felt like a place of shelter or routine. It felt like a threshold, something crossed without permission, something that could not be undone. He turned toward the stall, toward the horse, which had not moved. Its posture unchanged, steady, grounded, its eyes fixed on him with that same quiet awareness, as if nothing about this moment surprised it, as if this had always been the direction things would take. Ethan stepped closer, the distance between them closing until he could feel the warmth of the animal's breath in the still air. "You brought me here," he said softly, the words barely more than a breath, but they carried weight now, not as a question, but as an acceptance. The horse did not react, did not shift or pull away. It simply stood there, its presence calm and certain, and in that stillness, Ethan felt something shift inside himself, something that had been held tight for years beginning to loosen, not all at once, not enough to break, but enough to be noticed. He turned away then, his gaze moving across the barn, seeing it not as it was, but as it had been, years ago, before silence had taken hold, before the land had become something he managed instead of something he belonged to. The memory came in pieces, not clear, not complete, but enough to change the shape of the present. The corner where tools once hung in use instead of dust, the stall that had not always been empty, the sound of voices that no longer echoed here. He closed his eyes briefly, letting it pass through without holding it back, because now there was no space left to avoid it. The letter in his hand made sure of that. He looked down again, unfolding it once more, reading the lines again, slower this time, letting them settle deeper. The message did not change, but his understanding of it did. It was not just a note, not just a set of instructions or a confession. It was a decision left unfinished, a truth that had been placed here because it could not be carried any further, and now it had reached the one person it had been meant for, whether he had been ready or not. Ethan folded the paper carefully, not with hesitation now, but with intention, and set it back on the cloth beside the open box. The metal object remained in his hand a moment longer before he placed it down as well, his fingers lingering against it, as if confirming it was real. Then pulling away, he stepped back from the spot, from the hole in the ground that had become something more than just disturbed earth, and turned toward the open barn doors, the light outside brighter now, stretching across the land in long, quiet lines. The wind had softened, carrying with it the faint smell of dry grass and distance. He stood there at the threshold, not stepping out yet, not turning back either, just existing in the space between. The kind of moment where something ends without noise and something else begins without announcement. Behind him, the horse shifted. Once more, a single step, enough to close the distance it had been holding. Its presence now just behind him, not pushing, not guiding, simply there. And Ethan understood then, with a clarity that did not need explanation, that whatever had been hidden beneath his barn was only the beginning, not the answer, and that the path forward would not be about what he had found, but about where it would lead him next, because some things, once uncovered, do not stay in the ground, and some truths, once seen, do not allow a man to return to who he was before. The light outside had shifted by the time Ethan stepped fully into the yard, no longer pale and uncertain, but steady, stretching across the dry land in long bands that seemed to reveal more than they warmed. And for the first time in years, he did not see the ranch as something worn down or fading. He saw it as something holding its breath, waiting. The wind moved slower now, brushing against the fence posts with a softer sound, and behind him, the horse followed without needing to be led, its steps quiet but deliberate, each one placed with the same calm certainty it had carried since the moment it arrived. Ethan did not look back at first. He simply walked, his path not chosen by habit, but by something less defined, something that had begun in the barn and now stretched beyond it, past the house, past the rusted water trough, toward the far edge of the property where the land dipped slightly before rising again into low hills. He had not been out that way in a long time. Not since the years when the ranch had still felt alive with more than just routine. The ground there was different, less compact, marked by old tracks that had long since faded into the earth. And yet as he approached, he noticed something that made him slow his steps, a faint line cutting through the grass, subtle but consistent, as though something had passed that way more than once. Not recently, but not so long ago that it had been erased. He stopped, his gaze following the line as it curved gently toward a cluster of trees standing alone against the open sky, their branches thin but steady, casting shadows that stretched farther than Their size should allow. The horse moved beside him then, not ahead, not behind, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of it again. Its presence no longer unfamiliar, no longer something separate from the moment. Ethan turned his head slightly, meeting its gaze, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them. Not instruction, not command, just a quiet agreement that the path ahead was not random. He stepped forward again, following the faint trail, the sound of his boots softer now against the ground, as if the land itself was listening. The closer he came to the trees, the more the air seemed to change, cooler, heavier, carrying a scent that did not belong to dust or dry grass. Something older, something that had been there before the ranch, before the fences, before the silence had settled over everything. He reached the edge of the cluster and paused. The shadows beneath the branches deeper than the open land behind him, the light breaking into uneven patterns across the ground. And there, just beyond the first tree, he saw it. Not hidden, not buried, but waiting in plain sight. A structure, small and weathered, its wood darkened by time, its shape familiar. In a way that made his chest tighten before his mind could explain why. A cabin, older than the barn, older than most of what remained on the property. Its door slightly ajar, as if it had been left that way on purpose. Ethan stood still, the memory rising now not in fragments, but in something closer to clarity. The name from the letter echoing quietly in his thoughts, tied to this place in a way he could no longer deny. The horse stepped forward then, one slow movement that brought it just within the edge of the trees, its head lifting slightly, its attention fixed on the cabin with the same steady focus it had shown in the barn. Ethan felt it again, that pull, stronger now, not something he could ignore or question, but something that had already made the decision for him. He took a breath, steady and quiet, and stepped toward the open door, knowing without needing to say it that whatever truth had been uncovered beneath his barn had not been the end of the story, only the beginning, and that the answers waiting inside this place would not just explain the past, but change what came next. The door moved with a slow, uneven creak as Ethan pushed it open, the sound carrying into the stillness of the cabin like something waking after a long time. The air inside felt different from the outside, cooler, untouched, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something softer beneath it, something that lingered without fading. He stepped across the threshold without rushing, his boots settling onto the worn floorboards that held firm despite their age, and for a moment, he simply stood there, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light that filtered through the single window at the far wall. The space was small, simpler than he expected, a table, a chair, a shelf with a few scattered items that had not been moved in years. Nothing dramatic, nothing that demanded attention, and yet the quiet inside the room felt heavier than the open land outside, as if everything here had been left exactly as it was meant to be found. Ethan moved forward slowly, each step measured, his gaze passing over the table where a thin layer of dust had settled undisturbed, except for one place, a small, cleared area where something had once rested. He paused there, his hand hovering just above the surface, the absence more noticeable than any object could have been. Behind him, the horse remained just outside the doorway, its presence steady, its shadow stretching into the cabin without crossing fully inside, as if it had brought him here but would go no further. Ethan glanced back once, meeting its gaze briefly, and in that moment, he understood that whatever he was meant to see here, he would have to face alone. He turned back toward the room, his attention shifting to the far corner where the light gathered slightly stronger, and there, resting against the wall, he saw it. Another piece of the past left waiting, a framed photograph, its glass clouded with time, but not enough to hide the image within. He stepped closer, reaching out to lift it carefully, the frame light in his hands, the surface cool. He brushed the dust away with the edge of his sleeve, revealing the picture beneath. And as the details came into view, something inside him stilled completely. It was not just a photograph. It was a moment captured and held, a memory made visible, a younger version of himself standing beside another man, both of them facing the camera with the quiet confidence of a time when the future had not yet been weighed down by silence. And beside them, unmistakable even in stillness, stood a horse, strong, unbroken, its posture proud, its eyes alive with something familiar, something that echoed now in the presence waiting just outside the door. Ethan's breath slowed, his grip tightening slightly on the frame as the connection settled fully into place. The name from the letter, the object in the box, the land beneath his feet. It had all led here, not by accident, not by chance, but by something that had carried itself forward through time until it reached him again. He lowered the photograph slowly, setting it back where he had found it, but the weight of it remained, not in his hands, but in the space around him. He turned once more toward the doorway, toward the horse that had not moved, its eyes still fixed on him with that same quiet certainty. And for the first time since this began, Ethan felt something different rise within him. Not confusion, not hesitation, but a sense of clarity that did not need explanation. He stepped back out into the light, the sun now higher, the land stretching wide and open before him, but no longer empty. The past was no longer something buried beneath his feet or hidden in forgotten places. It had returned, not to haunt, but to be understood. And as he stood there beside the horse, the wind moving gently across the fields, he realized that some things are not lost when they disappear. They wait, patient and unchanging, until the moment comes when they can finally be found again. And sometimes, it is not the person who finds the truth, but the truth that finds the person, carried on quiet steps, across long distances, by something that never truly lost its way.